My name is Michelle Sikes, and I'm an assistant professor at Penn State University. Thank you very much for attending my talk today. Kenya to boycott sports event declared the front page of the Irish Times on May 29th, 1981, referring to the Irish Wheelchair Association Championships that drew athletes with disabilities to Dublin from the United Kingdom, Holland, Sweden, and elsewhere to compete in track and field, table tennis, archery, basketball, snooker, and swimming. In celebration of 1981 as the International Year of the Disabled, Irish event organizers had invited these overseas teams to compete in their national championships and to prepare Irish competitors for the upcoming International Stoke Manville Games, a major multi-sport competition for athletes with disabilities. Kenya was expected to become the only African nation to take part in the 1981 Irish Wheelchair Association Championships. However, 2 days before their departure for Ireland, Kenyan officials withdrew their team from the Dublin competition in protest. Their boycott was spawned by the Irish rugby team's recently launched tour of apartheid South Africa. By then, almost all international sports bodies had suspended contact with the Southern African nation. Rugby was the most important exception. South African obsession with rugby and the willingness by some international rivals to compete against the Springboks, the South African national team, turned international rugby tours into hotbeds of dissension. The New Zealand All Blacks rugby tour of South Africa in 1976 precipitated a boycott of the Montreal Olympics by 28 African nations, causing more than 400 African athletes, many already in Canada, to withdraw on the eve of the Games. 5 years later, during the 57 days between July 19th and September 13th, 1981, that the Springboks were in New Zealand, more than 200 demonstrations took place involving over 150,000 people, resulting in 2 matches canceled, nearly 2,000 arrests, and roughly half of New Zealand's total police force deployed in the largest ever police operation in New Zealand's history to ensure that the matches proceeded. Historian Malcolm McLean describes the final weeks of the tour as, quote, contested on the fields and the streets under siege-like conditions, end quote, with police and protesters squaring off in, quote, a scene that resembled medieval armies, where protesters had helmets and shields, and with lines of police in helmets and with face masks and meter-long aluminum batons held like pikes. A large body of historical work on sport and politics details how activists fought apartheid by any means possible, particularly with respect to high-profile competitions such as the Olympics, Commonwealth Games, and major rugby tours. Barred from international cricket and expelled from the Olympic movement, the Davis Cup, and international football, by the early 1980s, South Africa was isolated from almost all international sport. A major source of pressure came from independent African nations organized under the banner of the Supreme Council for Sport in Africa. Because rugby associations in Western nations remained beyond their influence and were defiant of their efforts to isolate the apartheid regime, African governments were willing to boycott other sports and third-party nations as an additional avenue through which to apply pressure. The Kenyan boycott of Ireland's 1981 wheelchair championships added to this multi-pronged attack on apartheid across almost all sport domains. Yet their protests of the Irish rugby tour of South Africa that took place in the first half of 1981 have been overshadowed by the events of July to September that year, when the Springboks tour of New Zealand drew thousands into the streets. Efforts to exclude South Africa from international parasport are particularly under-examined, especially those led by African activists elsewhere on the continent. As historians Aaron Bucom and Ian Britton note, scholars have paid little attention to, quote, the experience of diplomatic discourse relating to the relatively youthful Paralympic movement. With focus on Kenya, this paper takes up their call to study major parasport games as a lever of state diplomacy. Doing so sheds light on how governments and state actors used both Olympic and Paralympic sport to pursue particular policy aims. From the 1970s, Kenyan sport officials treated the participation of Kenyan athletes with disabilities as a way to advance the struggle against apartheid South Africa. Their efforts to enforce the anti-apartheid boycott in disability sport in 1981 involved two strategies. Kenya first withdrew from the 1981 Irish wheelchair championships in retaliation to Ireland's failure to stop its rugby team's tour of South Africa. Kenya then boycotted the 1981 International Stoke Mandeville Games in protest of South African participation in that festival. The competitive prospects of Kenyan athletes depended not only on whether South Africans participated in major parasport events, but also on international rugby tours involving South Africa. Despite calls to separate politics from parasport competitions as an apolitical domain, Kenyan leaders made no exceptions. They held athletes with disabilities to the same commitment to total disengagement with South Africa as was demanded of athletes in other realms. Kenyan involvement with parasport began with the establishment of the Kenyan Sports Association for the Disabled in the early 1960s. Initially a Nairobi-based initiative that focused on athletes with spinal cord injuries, the KSAD expanded to organize competitions across the country for athletes with a variety of impairments. The association first sent teams to international competitions in the early 1970s, including the Heidelberg Paralympics of 1972, where swimmer John Britton won Kenya's first Paralympic gold medal. Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi drew attention to people with disabilities in the early 1980s. He declared 1980 the National Year of the Disabled. Moi's focus prompted the Ministry of Housing and Social Services to launch several programs to strengthen parasport in Kenya, including holding the country's first ever National Sports Festival for the Disabled in Nairobi at the end of April 1980. That three-day event, which Moi attended as the guest of honor, drew athletes from all provinces to Nairobi for the competition. A total of 12 men and 4 women were then selected to represent Kenya at the 1980 Paralympics. Kenyan government officials expected parasport to play an important role in shaping the country's international reputation. Quote, "We are hopeful that with this very carefully selected team, we are sure medals will be won and the competitors are determined to come out top winners in Africa," declared a leading Ministry of Culture and Social Services official in 1980. Commissioner for Social Services Eliud Masale stated, quote, "Kenya is in the lead of the countries in Africa in sports for the disabled," and that, quote, "in the international scene, it is quite safe to say that Kenya ranked among the top countries in the world." Kenyan leaders invested in sport to gain international prestige, but also they withdrew their athletes from participation to influence international politics. Kenya boycotted the 1976 Montreal Olympics in protest of New Zealand's continued sporting ties with South Africa, the same year that it boycotted the Paralympics in Toronto, rather than compete alongside the South African team. The planned 1981 Irish rugby tour of South Africa also drew scrutiny from African activists. The Supreme Council for Sport in Africa, the central governing authority for sport on the continent, warned that Irish athletes in sports other than rugby would face penalties if the 1981 Irish rugby tour went ahead. The continental sport body recommended that African nations break all bilateral sporting ties with all Irish sport if the tour to South Africa took place. Amidst threats that Irish athletes in other sports would suffer the consequences for the tour, the Irish Times observed that the planned rugby visit, quote, cast a cloud over the competitive futures of this country. Kenyan sport officials also inspected international parasport competitions for any hint of direct South African involvement. In late 1980, the Ministry of Culture and Social Services authorized a Kenyan parasport team to compete in a national competition in Zimbabwe only after confirming that athletes from South Africa would not take part. Kenya was the only African nation to participate in the 1981 International Games for the Disabled, held in Austria, but first required multiple assurances of the exclusion of South Africa. Organizers of the 1981 Irish Wheelchair Association also sent written assurances to Kenyan officials that a South African team would not participate in their national championships, and initially, the Ministry of Culture and Social Services approved sending a Kenyan team to Ireland for the competition. Then, in a letter sent just days before the Irish Wheelchair Championships, Kenyan officials canceled the trip to Dublin. Kenya National Sports Council Secretary J.K. Tirop informed KSAD Chair Dorothy Hughes that her team could not participate, quote, because of the prevailing situation whereby the Irish rugby team is currently in South Africa. They also vetoed Kenyan participation in the 1981 International Stoke Manville Games. Tirop told Hughes, "We are further informed that South Africa is likely to send a paraplegic team to the Stoke Manville Games." He stated that their participation alongside South Africa, quote, will not be in conformity to the Kenyan stand on apartheid. Tirop concluded, quote, the invitations you have received should not be accepted unless you are advised otherwise by this office. Kenyan government officials controlled whether parasport athletes took part in international competitions. They declined to enter any competition in which South Africans were involved, insisting that only a boycott would advance an anti-apartheid agenda. Despite calls to treat major parasport games as an apolitical realm, they treated such events as but one more component of this broader political effort, affording it no exception. Any bids for medals at overseas events rested on the conditions that South Africans not take part. In contrast, the Irish government failed to stop their rugby team from touring South Africa in 1981. Although the Irish Prime Minister opposed the tour and urged rugby authorities to abandon their plans to compete in South Africa, noting that their trip could damage wider Irish political, economic, and sporting interests, rugby officials ignored his concerns. Irish Wheelchair Association Chief Executive Phil Meacher told the Irish Times that he regretted Kenya's withdrawal on account of the rugby tour of South Africa, but blamed his fellow countrymen, stating, quote, I think everybody in this country was aware of the possible consequences of that tour going ahead. The fight to isolate South Africa in sport affected athletes' opportunities everywhere. The Kenyan government was unyielding in its refusal of any contact with any South African team or athlete as long as apartheid policy existed. When boycott threats failed to end the rugby tours of South Africa by Western nations, Kenya sought to nullify all efforts, internal or external, that threatened that policy. Kenyan commitment to the anti-apartheid cause and to the boycott as a strategy diminished opportunities for Kenyan athletes, but governmental policy concerning parasport was consistent with policy regarding all other sports, and officials resisted efforts to compromise that principled stance. Thank you for your attention.